it's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
The journalist plays an important and multifaceted role in sports. Just as news journalists confront ethical issues in deciding what the public should know and how events should be portrayed, sports journalists make tough decisions also. They make decisions regarding what the public will know about sports-related stories. They decide how much evidence is needed to make allegations and what stories should be told. Like news journalists, sports journalists may face conflicts of interest between their media owners and the story the journalist wants to tell. Media outlets themselves may confront difficult ethics and management issues regarding the stories they want covered and how the stories should be told to their audience. Some of the most important sports journalists of our time gathered at the Summit, the first international conference on ethics in sports. Let's consider their views regarding the state of sports journalism today.
I'm going to speak just briefly and a little more broadly about the state of sports journalism at the moment. I think that we've kind of lost our ethical compass in this business. And I say that because I think we've professionally have cannibalized ourselves bit by bit, not in large chunks, but in small bites, time and time again, that I see over the course of covering events or attending events. And I mean things that you see, such as, in a large chunk, the influence of sports talk radio, which is, when it's convenient for the hosts or the buffoons or whoever you want, or the entertainers, whoever are behind the mic at the time, when it's to their advantage, call themselves sports journalists. I'm a journalist. And if they make a mistake or if they say something that's in error, well, then I'm just entertaining. But we're all in that same boat with those individuals when it goes into a locker room or something like that. In smaller chunks, I see us at major events getting into fights over who's going to get what goodie bags that are being presented or passed out by the leagues in which we're supposed to be covering, or arguments over tickets. I see things such as the Michael Irvin case in Dallas, where we took an unsubstantiated accusation by a woman with a questionable past, put it on the air, called the police station, had them react to it, put it on the air without ever bothering to call Michael Irvin, who would, if you had taken that time, would have said, would have categorically denied being in the position that they said he was in. That caused a firestorm for the Dallas Cowboys for 3 days, disrupted their preparations for a championship game, because someone, I thought, didn't do the most basic fundamental things that you should do in our business or any business if you're calling yourself a professional journalist.
I think the issue is that I don't know whether we've lost our way. I've lost my way for sure, but I don't know whether we've lost our way or we've never found it, or, in the hot new word that I've learned, that we have to contextualize the fact that the society around us has changed. But the issue is that, and I'm speaking certainly for myself and for the Times and for most of the papers and magazines that I read, is that we haven't really figured out what sports writing is supposed to be writing about. Are we entertainment writers? Are we writers on the tit, like wine writers and travel writers and food writers? Are we news hounds? Are we, the investigative reporters that Sandy would like us to be? Are we gossip mongers? What really is our role? How can we be news people covering events that were scheduled a year ago? How can we deal with social issues when, after a while, people are bored with us when we do? There was a wonderful story in New York on Sunday and the way it was covered, the bastard son of a biker babe, fat, quote, free spirit, tattooed, beer belly, pitches a perfect game. Redemption. I was just, everything was in there. Then a couple of days later, the perfect game was spoiled by the foul ugliness of a baseball brawl in which Darryl Strawberry goes out and clocks another player after one of the Orioles pitchers brushed back and hit a Yankee. But the real story in the Yankees that's been going on for years is that the owner, a man who really should be here at the ethics conference, should be our keynote speaker since George Will wasn't available this year, is a man who has very carefully and precisely disrespected an entire chunk of New York, the Bronx, black and Hispanic population, in his attempt to get money from the city and move the ballpark downtown for his own advantage. So which story do we do? And how do we do it? And is it really our role to turn over every rock? Do we really care? Don't we want to really revel in the joy? There's a gentleman here who stands up at every seminar and talks about fun. Well, yeah, we are losing that. And so the question is just who are we? If we work for a responsible publication, like the New York Times claims to be, they're faintly embarrassed at having a sports section, always have been. And yet, if you'll notice in the last year or so, more and more sports stories are on the front page. And maybe because of Sandy, an investigative team is now from Metro is now in the sports department. So the question is, who are we?
My concern is, where the next generation of sports books is going to come from. And my concern, more than anything else, has to do, I've been doing this now for almost 30 years. My concern is that because the athletes are now beginning to make so much money, and that their celebrity as such is the thing that's most important to them, as a result of that, I think what you're going to see is that a lot of these athletes don't need any of us. It's not necessary for them to talk to newspaper reporters, to be interviewed by magazine writers, or to have books written about them, or for them even to participate in the making of these books. I think we're going to start to see that fairly soon. What these athletes need more than anything else is a quick soundbite on TV to maintain their celebrity. When I started in this business, a fellow like Sparky Lyle, for $40,000 back in 1978, that was a significant amount of money for him. And he was the Cy Young Award winner that year when we started doing the Bronx Zoo. It's very hard to go to a ball player who's making, you usually want a star ball player because editors want stars. It's hard to go to Albert Bell, who's making $10 million a year, and say a publisher will pay you, $100,000 to write a book. It's going to take 35 hours of conversation, and after that, we have to sit and go over it. You've got to read it, and then after that, when the book comes out, you've got to expose yourself to multiple interviews from reporters around the country who want to talk about your book. Well, back in 1978, for Sparky Lyle, that was a wonderful opportunity. It was good money, and he was happy. He was the first one to talk about George Steinbrenner and how much he disliked the man. So that was part of the mystique of that book. But he had no PR handlers. he had no problem at all telling me what was going on in his life. What you want if you're doing a book with somebody is you want somebody who's going to be open and honest, perhaps a little angry, and certainly funny. And that's what Sparky was, and that was part of what was so wonderful about our book. But today, trying to find people who are not guarded with their image, people who want to write a book because there's a certain what's the word for writing a book? Having your book on the shelf, you get notoriety. Yeah, all of those things.
Royalties.
But see, if your athlete's making $7 or $8 million a year, that's not part of the equation anymore. And so in the book business, I'm worried about that. We're the next generation of sports sort of tell-all books going to come from. The other problem in the book business is that these large book companies seem to want celebrities. So that's the other part. If you as a writer want to write a book, you've got to go out and find one of these celebrities to do it in order to sell a book.
I work primarily in book publishing, and people often ask me what do I think is the most influential sports book of all time. And for me, that's a fairly easy answer, because it was a book that wasn't written by a journalist. It was written by a ball player. I'm referring to Ball 4 by Jim Bouton back in 1970. Now that changed a lot of the landscape in terms of book publishing, perhaps journalism, because for the first time you saw a situation where a ball player felt that he could actually speak the truth about his teammates. Now, that erupted, of course, into all sorts of questions about ethics and closed-door behavior, and is this right, is it wrong? Well, it's the truth. Yeah, but should he have done this to his teammates? And the question now, as we reach into the 21st century, has to do with, again, book publishing, a question of First Amendment. Do people have a right to know? Are athletes really, in fact, public figures, professional athletes? So we're entitled to know everything about not only their public performances, but of course about their private lives as well. Now, book publishing, it's usually pretty simple. Most books that are published really don't work. It's a real leap of faith to go into a bookstore and plunk down $20 or $25 to say, I'm going to see if I like this book. Because you usually can't bring it back. It isn't like a library. But over the course of time with book publishing, and sports in particular, these issues always erupt. And the question we have to face from a book publishing point of view is to try and figure out whether the public's right to know, their interest to know what's going on with athletes and journalists is valid enough to substantiate writing a book. And all the time, I'm presented with proposals from books, from authors, from literary agents, saying this is going to be the real deal. This is going to really be the ultimate expose. And I have to ask myself, is that really what people want to read? So these kind of issues happen all the time, and I listen to my esteemed colleagues here talk about daily questioning. How do you make this decision? It's a tremendous burden to put on people as journalists to try to figure out what's the right or wrong thing to do. It may sound simple, but it's not.
The ethics and management issues which sports journalists confront may differ based on their own conception of what a sports journalist should be, and may differ based on the type of sports journalism that they do. Armen Keteyian focused on the conflicts of interest which he believes that journalists should guard against. He cites several examples of cases where journalistic integrity is likely to be compromised. The commonplace nature of these compromises compels Armen to say that he believes that sports journalists have lost their ethical compass. Bob Lipsyte focuses on the lack of precision regarding the nature of sports journalism. Are we investigative reporters? Are we storytellers? Or are we like the movie or food critics in the paper? He notes the difficulties of having clear standards of performance when we have not really figured out what sports writing is supposed to be at all. Peter Golenbach asked, where will the next generation of tell-all books come from, now that the players make so much money that the incentive to work with journalists is all but gone? Rick Wolf shares the difficulties of deciding what books to put into print and believes that it is a tremendous burden to put on journalists to require them to try and figure out the right or wrong thing to do. He claims that it may sound easy, but it is not. But if they are not held responsible, who should be? Sports journalists for newspapers, magazines, books, television, and the internet have ethical and management issues in common, as well as have issues which are all their own. One important thread connects sports journalists, and that is the individual journalist is responsible for making their own choices regarding journalistic integrity. How that personal ethical choice is made requires shared standards, interpersonal criticism, and serious discussions regarding differences of opinion.
Conflict of interest is a terrible problem. The examples that Sandy cited of just outrageous conduct that we allow to happen. It's not just in sports. Cokie Roberts and Sam Donaldson gladly accept $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 checks for speaking engagements for associations that they then turn around and cover and don't think anything about it. So we have problems in sports journalism. We have problems in journalism as a whole that ideally we would address ourselves. We're very reticent to write about ourselves. We're happy to point the finger at other people, but far be it from us to point the finger at somebody in our own business. You want one quick example? At the Super Bowl this year, the writers were invited to tour Callaway Golf. Larry Dorman, who is the VP of marketing for Callaway, used to cover the NFL for the Miami Herald and the New York Times. Invited everybody out. At the end of the tour, anybody who wanted one was offered a Big Bertha golf club. Retails for, well, I'm not a golfer, what, $400? $500? You want one? Take it. You think any of those reporters who took them, and I was not there, I have this secondhand. There were about 25 people who took them. You think any of that was reported? You think these are guys who might not cover golf sometime? Very possibly. If that's not a clear conflict of interest, I don't know what is.
CBS occasionally, believe it or not, 60 Minutes in the middle of the NCAA tournament will go out and do a piece that's pretty unflattering to college basketball, right in the middle of the Final Four. And it sends Billy Packer into conniptions because he thinks that, hey, we're business partners, there's no secret, we should all scratch each other's back. Well, Billy Packer's not a journalist, but maybe Mary could kick it off and a few other people could talk about it, just the pressures, how you feel them, how you...
Right. It's hard. This is more than a couple of years ago now. I know a lot of stuff that I never do talk about, and everyone's got their own, people's spines bend differently. It's just how you're hardwired. You have to decide basically at the end of the day on your own. Is this something I should report? Is this something I should keep to myself? And over the last several years, I've been offered pretty good-looking dough to write, an inside tennis book, all the stuff I know. And this one guy keeps coming at me, and throwing $20 bills at me and saying, you should write this story. You should write this book. And I said, well, I don't want to write that book. I'm not going to write that book. And he says, but you know everything. And I say, yeah, well, I know everything because the people who tell me everything know I'm not going to write about it.
Rick, jump on this, Rick.
No, I'm not talking about it.
No, it's not him. It's not Rick. But what happened more than a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Jennifer Capriati, this is when she was having problems, but no one really knew much about them, and she trained right here in Tampa at Saddlebrook. And a very good friend of mine worked there, continues to work there, and he called me up one night and said that this kid was in all kinds of trouble, and she was really a mess, and, he was just telling me that, it sounds like she's doing all kinds of drugs, and she's, and I felt badly about it because I always did like the kid. I thought she was really a victim of circumstance in a lot of ways, and she obviously was all at sea and had lost her way. And I hung up the phone, And I thought about it a while, and then I said to my husband, what do I owe ESPN? Because I was working for ESPN at the time. I said, what do I owe my employer? And he said, what are you talking about? So I told him the story. I said, do I have to call somebody at ESPN? And he said, he said, well, what do you think? I said, and the kid had already had all kinds of problems, and she'd had weight problems by then. And anyway, I didn't call. And a couple of weeks later, the kid gets busted for shoplifting, and then it turns out she's doing within a couple of weeks, the story was out there. Should I have reported it? I don't know. I'm glad I didn't, The Capriati family still hates me, because once it happened, I was very judgmental about why it happened and what I thought should have happened instead, and how I thought that it was awful that they ever allowed this kid to turn pro when she was 13 years old anyway. So, but that kind of stuff happens, again, in my sport, when there were more than a handful of people who knew that Arthur Ashe had AIDS. And when the story, he was outed, by, and that was just a god-awful thing. This guy had no intention of having to go up and give a press conference before hundreds of people and explain that, yes, in fact, he did have AIDS. I would never, those are the calls you make. I would never have, and I didn't know. And Arthur was a friend of mine, but I am not one of those people who knew he had AIDS. But if I had known, Lord knows, I would never have gone with that kind of a story.
The first thing when I think about the state of sports journalism today is a tabloid culture that is changing media perceptions and all sorts of coverage with it. Networks owning the sports they cover. Magazine like Sports Illustrated serving as an official sponsor of the Olympic Games. A columnist for the Boston Globe working for NBC, at the same time brokering a deal for a football coach named Bill Parcells to become the head coach of the New York Jets. A prominent New York City sports talk show host owning racehorses with Bill Parcells. An ESPN reporter, according to the New York Daily News, owning racehorses with Rick Pitino. Sports writers and broadcasters literally feeding at the troughs of professional sports and college athletic teams, most of the time for free, not all of the time. A desensitization process that has set in among young sports writers who do not understand or see drug stories because they have grown up in a drug culture, or who don't see gambling as a problem because they have grown up in that culture. The lines between print and TV reporters completely blurred by people working both sides of the streets at the same time, agents representing players as well as broadcasters and writers, a cultural void enhanced by the lack of diversity in newsrooms, and a whole new delivery system called the Internet that has its own particular problems with ethical standards right now.
Sports journalists must make hard choices concerning their responsibilities to their readers, to their owners, to their sport, and to their athletes and families. John Rawlings pointed out that media outlets must earn a profit. So those sports stories that contribute to maintaining and increasing their audience and ad revenues are in high demand. But he believes that sports journalists should police the journalistic choices made by their fellow journalists and rat on those when they have made poor choices. Alexander Wolf and Mary Carrillo address the responsibilities of sports journalists in providing the public with everything the journalist knows about the athlete or the sport. When should the journalist respect an athlete's right to their personal life, and when should the journalist report on athletes' off-court behavior because of the public's right to know? Sandy Padwick provides examples of how sports journalists face conflicts of interest most everywhere they turn. How can we identify, much less enforce, standards of journalistic integrity in sports coverage? It is evident that different journalists see some of their obligations differently. Is this a case of healthy disagreement or evidence of a profession out of control and a profession without standards? History tells us that the early years of a profession's development are characterized by disagreement regarding the applicable standards. And over time and after much discussion among their members, the successful profession matures and coalesces around an agreed-upon set of core values and standards which enable the layperson and the professional alike to characterize exemplary performance as well as identify poor performance by those who claim membership in the profession.